Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and making the time to do that. And what is a pretty hectic January is what I'm feeling so far. So we'll give Zoom a couple minutes to let all of the participants stream in. But as you're settling in, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this question in the chat. In your experience, what makes a leader trustworthy? In your experience, what makes a leader trustworthy? Authenticity. And hi, Christina, nice to see you. Transparency, integrity, benevolence, efficacy. I love that. That sounds like it is from a framework. Vulnerability, honesty, re follow through, reliability. Well, you're already touching on so many of the themes that we'll be touching on in today's webinar. And it seems like we've got a good number of people in the room now, so I'll just go ahead and get us started. I'm Mylene Duong. I'm the VP of Research and Innovation at the Constructive Dialogue Institute, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Just a couple of housekeeping items. We will be sending the slides and the recording after this webinar to anyone who's registered, and we'll have the time for the panelists to answer a few questions at the end. And we might also be able to get to them throughout, hopefully. So as questions occur to you, just go ahead and put them into the Q&A box. So you can find that button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So again, go ahead and put them into the Q&A as they occur to you. You don't need to wait until the end. They'll actually help us move quickly on time. As we dive in, and hopefully you've bumped into this along the way. Let's go to the next slide, Emma. We hope that you'll join us at the Constructive Dialogue Leadership Institute in October in Washington, D.C. This is the second year that we'll be running this cohort. You'll be joining other university leadership teams in strategic planning around strengthening a culture of constructive dialogue on your campus. And our inaugural cohort consisted of some of the panelists that you'll see here today. So let me actually just introduce our three phenomenal panelists, all of whom are leaders that I admire. First, we'll hear from Emma Jones. And I have the distinctive privilege of working with Emma on the Leadership Institute. And she's a member of Credo's executive leadership team. She has experience in leadership development. She's particularly passionate about supporting women leaders in higher education and fostering collaboration across campuses nationwide. She's also the executive editor of Credo Press and has led the production of several significant publications, including Surviving to Thriving and Pivot, a Vision for the New University. And I learned something from Emma literally every single time I interact with you. It is a true gift. Today, she'll give us an overview of a framework for how we can think about trust and why it feels particularly important in this moment. And then we'll hear from Darrell Wheeler, who serves as the 9th president of the State University of New York, New Paltz. SUNY New Paltz is a distinguished institution known for its commitment to academic excellence and inclusive education. President Wheeler is a nationally recognized scholar and leader, and he's dedicated his career to addressing health disparities, fostering diversity, and advancing equitable access to education. And I actually first met President Wheeler at a conference where I heard him tell the story of his leadership journey. And I was so struck by his authenticity and courage that I wanted you all to also benefit from his wisdom. And so today he'll share some practical advice for building trust. And then to wrap up the webinar, we'll hear from Hiram Chodosh, who is the 5th president of the Claremont McKenna College. And Claremont McKenna was recently ranked 1st among U.S. liberal arts colleges and 5th overall among U.S. universities by the Wall Street Journal. President Chodosh is a renowned scholar and innovator in higher education and in global justice reform. And under his leadership, Claremont McKenna has become a national liberal arts leader for the highest return on value. In 2023, the college announced the completion of a nearly $1.1 billion campaign, which is the largest in liberal arts history and topped the Forbes list of 33 institutions with an A+ in financial strength. Please do not ask him any questions about fundraising. That is not what this webinar is about. He is also a leader and committed advocate for freedom of expression, for viewpoint diversity, and for constructive dialogue. And so all of us working in this field, including all of us at CDI, owe him a great debt of gratitude for his courageous trailblazing in this area. So I'm beyond proud to be part of bringing these voices to you today. And now I'll just hand it over to Emma to talk about the state of trust in higher ed and how we can think about this super important but very nebulous topic.
Thank you so much, Mylene. Hello, everyone. It is wonderful to be here with you on this Wednesday, this afternoon, where I am on the East Coast. And this is just one of my favorite things to talk about. So thank you, Mylene, and to CDI for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here with these two leaders today. It is an interesting moment to talk about trust in higher education, to talk about trust broadly in institutions in our country, but we will do the best that we can to think about where we are and what might be ahead. And I wanted to start with something that we all know and are familiar with, which is that when we think about trust in our institution, trust in higher education, we are really thinking about the confidence that the country has in our work and in our sector. So we are seeing these headlines everywhere. They are all over the country. The national narrative right now about higher education is not fabulous, right? We have seen some real changes in this narrative over the course of the last decade. This last one here, I imagine that many of you are familiar with this research by Gallup that showed that only 36% of Americans have confidence in higher education. That is a pretty dramatic drop over the course of the last few years. In 2016, nearly 60% of the country had confidence in higher education. We are now at 36% overall, and that was 2023. This continues to shift. So we know when we look at that as well that it's really important to start breaking that down and thinking about, well, where are we really seeing those changes in confidence? At the highest level, it's important to note that there isn't a single demographic group, not one, where the confidence in higher education has increased. That has not happened across any demographic group. I think you see here in my orange boxes that these are some of the most dramatic drops that we saw in the 2023 study across Republicans, those with no college degree, women, and those who are 55 and older. I think it's also really notable in here to see that there were double-digit drops in people who do have a college degree and in those that have postgraduate degrees. We would think often about these being our greatest champions, right? People who have been really connected to higher education, who hopefully have benefited from their experience and the work that we do on campuses. So really concerning, right, across the board to see that from a variety of demographic perspectives, the confidence in higher education continues to drop. There was a really interesting study done by Populous in 2023. It was published in early 2024 called The Misunderstanding of the American Dream. This is a fascinating study. I highly recommend taking a look at it. And broadly, the focus of this study was really on what do Americans see now across all demographic groups as markers for a successful life, as markers for achieving the American dream. What was notable in here is where education fell in this real examination of markers of a successful life. And the picture wasn't very pretty. Americans aren't just indifferent toward conventional indicators of educational achievement, such as college diplomas. In this study, those accolades were actively devalued. You can see here on this little graph, it's one of the snapshots from this study, that having a high school diploma, an advanced degree, or a four-year bachelor's degree fell very, very low in the markers for a successful life. What rose up really significantly in the rankings was having a certification in a skilled trade, having practical skills. There have been other studies that have lifted this up, that what parents are most hopeful for their kids as they go through K-12 is not college readiness, but it is, in fact, having skills to live their life, having practical skills more than anything else. So this is a pretty dramatic shift. There were a lot of drops here for education overall when we think about what makes a successful life. What populists said when they really did this research and found this was that what this told them is that for Americans in general, education appears to be more of a means to an end rather than an indicator of success in its own right. So an interesting shift that we're seeing there. So some of the things that I reflect on a lot as I'm thinking about trust in higher education, I work with a lot of leadership teams. My company works with presidents and boards of trustees across the country. And what we see continuously in and outside of higher education is that trust is so important in environments navigating change. I think we can all safely say that higher education is in a constant state of change. That is the one constant for us right now. But in our experience, anecdotally, trust is often in really short supply on campuses. We do not see deeply trusting environments on campus very frequently. Trust is also really consistently identified as a key competency of leadership. Many of you might have seen the study that was released just a few short weeks ago by Academic Search that talked about, that had surveyed, and more than 700 presidents responded to that survey to say, what are the top competencies for post-pandemic presidential leadership? And the number one competency as a result of that study was trust building. And that is what presidents said they most needed to be able to do and the skill that they needed to be able to have in their leadership. But what we see is that trustworthiness does not always equal being trusted. I have this experience all the time, you all, in conversations with presidents. By and large, I find campus leaders to be incredibly trustworthy humans, right? You look at all the sort of markers for trustworthy behavior, working with integrity. I saw that in the chat earlier. Incredibly trustworthy people, but they are not trusted in their environments. And so I am always thinking about what is that gap between trustworthy behavior and trust actually occurring in an environment. My very academic take on what that is institutional muck, right? That we have all of this institutional baggage that can sort of live in the middle between trustworthy behavior and trust existing in an environment. And that's really hard to wade through, right? It's really complex to work through that. We work in complex environments, right? Institutions, colleges, and universities are really complex and creates complexity in that regard. Trust is also often, if you look at lots of different definitions of trust, it's defined as something that's built between individuals. It is fundamentally relational, but we work in organizations. So we have to figure out how to scale that trust into large groups. Also a challenge. As Mylene said, as we headed into this conversation, trust is kind of a nebulous idea. I think about this as one of those things when your kids come to you and say, well, what is trust? And you go, I know what that means. What are the words that I'm going to use to describe that to you here in a succinct way, right? Conceptually, I understand it, but how do we really define that in a way that it's usable and that we can have that as a part of a shared language? And we might not be talking about the same thing when we bring it up because it is such a nebulous idea. I read a study recently that was done on a campus that was implementing a distributed leadership model. So it was a significant change initiative for the campus. And when the researchers talked to senior leadership about trust, so what does trust mean for you in this environment? The leaders talked about sharing information. They said, we are sharing as much as we can. We're giving all of this information to our campus community and really hoping to build trust in that, right? Because we want to share that information with them and have them share in the knowledge that we have. And when they talked to the campus community about trust and how they thought about trust in that environment, campus leaders, particularly across senior faculty, said, trust to me means being trusted to make decisions about things in my area of influence and having the information that I need in order to make those decisions effective. So there's a little bit of overlap there, but fundamentally the conversation was a little bit different. So when they were talking about trust, they were defining that differently, which meant that they weren't able to fully actualize the trust that they were hoping to build through that change initiative. I thought that was an interesting example, sort of ways to think about that. So what I'd like to do is to introduce you really briefly to a model for trust that I really like. There are a lot of different models of trust out there. This is one that I find to be particularly applicable and interesting. So this is a 4-factor of trust model that was developed a few years ago. They continue to do research in this regard. And the first of these 4 factors is transparency. So it's an immediate follow-on from what I was just sharing, right? That so often we think about trust as being built through sharing information. As I was thinking about, getting ready for this moment today and the sort of moment of change that we are in nationally in this moment as well, I was thinking about how during the pandemic in 2020, when all of that got started, there were so many decisions that had to be made with partial data and a lot of unknowns behind those decisions. So most leaders were radically transparent. I mean, we had to be, because we just had to say, this is what we know right now. And once I know more, you will know more, right? We were all at the table in a very different way to bring information forward as quickly as we could to try to make the best decisions that we could in that moment and bring people along. I am somewhat stunned to think about how similar a moment we are in right now. We are making decisions with partial information, with a lot of unknowns ahead of us, trying to bring our campus communities along, have everybody feel supported through that process. I think we are entering into another period of radical transparency with our communities in order to build trust through a really nebulous period of time. The second factor of trust is capability. This is about the observable skills required to deliver on promises. Someone put in the chat, what do you think about in terms of a leader as it relates to trust? And someone said proof. And that's what I think about when I think about capability, right? That we have the ability to do this. People in our environment really need to be able to see that they need to see leaders demonstrate that they are capable, that they have the expertise or the experience or the skills to support the mission, to achieve the goals. And this is a both and, right? This goes both ways. This goes right back to that study where faculty were saying, I want to be trusted to make decisions. Stakeholders need to experience an endorsement of their own capability. They need to hear, I believe that you are capable of making decisions that matter. So this is both seeing capability in leadership and in empowering capability in the environment of a campus. The third factor of trust is reliability, continual delivery on the promises made. This is such an important one. This is where we say, are we making promises that we are keeping? We talk about this, I think, a lot in an enrollment and retention sense, right? Are we telling students a story that is really authentic? So as they come to us in our environment, we are then delivering on that promise and they want to stay because what they heard they were going to get is what they're getting, right? That experience that they signed up for, that they put their trust in us to deliver is what they are experiencing in our environment. And I think the same is true for our faculty and our staff and our other stakeholders, our community members, our alumni, our donors. Are we saying, here's what we're going to do, and then we're delivering on that? And or we are also course correcting when things don't go exactly the way that we planned, because there's plenty of that happens as well, right? I think this links so closely back to transparency, where we are saying, here are the promises that we want to keep. And if something didn't work, we're going to say that too. We're going to own it, and we're going to move on. The final factor of trust is humanity, recognizing the uniqueness of each person. As I talked about before, trust is fundamentally relational. So relationships really matter. I think one question for us is how many people are or can be empowered to build trusting relationships across your stakeholder groups? Because we can't all be in individual conversations with everyone. It's not a realistic expectation. So how is our institutional voice distributed across a really amazing group of people who can speak on behalf of the institution and build those trusting relationships in lots and lots of different ways? I continue to think that one of the hardest things is to imagine how we scale relational trust into organizations. It's a really big ask. I think the last thing I would say about humanity is that if there has ever been a moment in our work and in our country that what people need from leaders, from us, is to be seen and valued and acknowledged for their humanity. I mean, this is a moment where that is what is needed. I am hearing this from college presidents all over the country, from senior leaders as they are talking with their constituents, trying to navigate the uncertainty that is ahead. There is a real acknowledgement of the importance and the value of humanity as we navigate challenging pathways together. And I think this one is going to continue to be one that really rises up in the weeks ahead as critically important. So I hope that high-level overview was helpful and gives you some things to think about. Again, there are a lot of models of trust out there that are really fascinating. This is one that I have found to really resonate, and I hope it gives you something to think about as we go from here. But you are going to now hear from two amazing leaders who have done such thoughtful work in this area, and I'm really pleased to hand it over to President Wheeler. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Emma. And I will apologize up front to everyone. I don't always sound like this, but whatever little bugs are going around, I managed to come down with one. But I'm happy to be here. I won't use slides, but if you could leave that slide up just for a moment. And I want to pick up on this theme. I have an ABC approach that I'm going to use about some practical elements. Those ABCs are active listening, brave listening, and compassionate listening. But I want to follow on Emma's components of humanity, transparency, capability, and reliability. When we talk about the context of higher ed and the way in which I've come into my roles as higher ed, as a higher education leader, and I've been doing this in various capacities for nearly 33 years, the transactional relationship that I have seen evolve or devolve in higher ed has actually contributed to the erosion of the relationship that I see between and amongst colleagues. And by transactional relationship, I'm talking about the approach that a higher ed position is a means to an ends of income, not for the purpose of that many came into higher ed for in terms of deep thinking, deep teaching. And what we have seen is a lot of checking out. And I was watching some of the question feeds, and I think this ties into some of the question feeds that I saw. And that when internally we are not all on the same page about why we teach and what the relationship is between this very sacred opportunity we have to dive deeply into our disciplines and to be able to work in spaces where addressing difficult questions should be part of what we do, we've actually gone into compartmentalized worlds. Some of that exists within higher ed, amongst and between faculty, staff, and students, where we operate in silos and not for common ends. On the note that Emma was making about trust and trustworthiness, I do want to pick up on this theme. The acknowledgement, and I say this in my opening to campus communities, I don't want people to trust me. I want people to give me the opportunity to be trusted. One of the reasons that trust, in my observation, and I'm a social worker by training and have had clinical practice before, one of the difficulties about mandating trust is people become skeptical of you as soon as you say, trust me. It is important to allow the person we're asking to trust us to define what trust means in their own space. Now, these attributes that were described are absolutely critical to seeding that. But demanding that someone trust you or to say you trust me actually can put someone on the defensive because they're like, why should I trust you? And then you're in a battle about a secondary or a tertiary issue as opposed to giving them the privilege of being at the driver's seat. The other thing about trust, it is fragile. Think about it in your own personal relationships. Trust probably isn't something that lives in a constant state across our life course. It is something that gets tested and tried. And when we're honest with ourselves, we fail at it in our own lives. I tell people there are days I wake up and don't like myself. And if I could get rid of me without the damage to me, I'd probably do away with me as well. And so being honest about that is really important, and it often helps to diffuse the tension that someone has to be in a constant state of like with you, because like is conflated with trust and that feeling that we get. And so I think about it in terms of a state trait model, and that the state versus the trait being the underlying expression and experience versus the state being the thing that it is in that moment. I may trust you on one thing, but have questions in another situation. And sometimes when we're in work environments where our work colleagues or our friend colleagues, that gets to be a lot of, I forget the phrase you use, but it's a very complex thing, Emma, where we're doing that. Contextualization is another critical component of this in terms of building trust in communication. What is the context? Is the context related to, back to the transactional component, issues related to money? Boy, those become really complex. And I've been in lots of situations where the discussion devolves immediately to resources as opposed to deeper issues. And when I get into a situation where I'm debating the focus of the discussion, it's easier for me, I think, to lose trust because I'm in a battle with my colleagues about the content and not so much about the purpose. And I'm going to come back to that in the ABCs. And then finally, in working with a group, it's really important to remember that a group is more than the sum of the individuals. It really is about the various relationships that are occurring amongst group members. And working in higher ed, there are so many relationships that I have to pay attention to because people live on multiple levels. And violating trust or challenging trust in one sphere can have an impact on how people perceive your ability to be trustworthy or trusted in other spheres. And walking into spaces where I haven't anticipated the implications, when I move from one school to another, because if I'm in the School of Engineering, we may be talking about equipment. If I'm talking to the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, we may not be talking equipment, and I use language that is off-putting. It's really important for me to remember the context in which I find myself. That's a lot of the background for and things that built right off of Emma's presentation. But I want to give shout out to one of my colleagues and actually an alum of our program, Dr. Stu Friedman, who wrote a book called Total Leadership. If you haven't seen it, I'd encourage you to at least take a look at it. One of the things that he posits in his work is that we get into a lot of trouble when we work out of a zero-sum based approach. And we talk about balancing elements to trust. Yes, the name of the book, thank you, because my voice is not the clearest right now. It's Total Leadership, Total Leadership. And I'll type it in when I'm done. And it's by Stu Friedman. And in his book, he talks about actually moving away from a balancing discussion to an integrative approach. And that when we talk an integrative approach, we actually give ourselves permission to work in multiple domains at once, and that those domains feed on each other to reinforce and support a common goal and mission. So I give that as a backdrop because I'd like to conclude my presentation by giving you 3 examples of how I've tried to apply this. But let me come to the ABCs that I mentioned first. The first thing that I'd like to talk about is active listening. In active listening, we are seeking not just to hear, but to suspend our prejudgments about what we're supposed to think and what we're supposed to answer. And that is a difficult process. And facilitating trust, I think, requires us to listen very deeply and very carefully. An example I give students or colleagues sometimes is if I'm in a crowded space, I can hear and listen to conversations all across the room, but I'm only actually attending actively to one conversation. So everything else is background noise. Even though I might be able to jump into somebody else's conversation, I'm really devoting the attention of understanding, meeting, and focusing on a particular conversation. In active listening, one of the things that I'm doing is trying to discern, is the person or the group talking about particular needs that they have? And needs come in many different forms. And it's important for me to listen to the various different forms that they might manifest in. One of them might be express needs, the things that we're actually saying we want. Felt needs might be the things that we hold near and dear within our souls and are trying to convey, may or may not have the words to do it. Comparative needs are related to those things that we see other people having that we may want or think we want. And then normative needs are those that society or the university environment say that I should have. I should have 5 publications. Well, maybe 5 publications is great for somebody, but maybe 2 is as good for somebody else. And so we're starting really listening to what people are saying to me about how they're coming into it. Because again, back to the concept of trust and leadership, I can miss a critical point if I'm listening to make my response as opposed to listening to make meaning of what the person or the group is saying to me. On B, and this is one that was also highlighted by Emma, I call it brave listening. And that is truly about being vulnerable and being able to accept the fact that I don't have all the answers, as was pointed out, and to be able to say that clearly. Another thing that I have to do sometimes, and I certainly did this during the COVID pandemic as we were moving through, is to be able to say to people, I do have content, but I am not at liberty to share it with you right now. And that honesty about saying to people you have additional content that is proprietary or not ready to be expressed is often very helpful because people can detect BS. They can sense whether or not you're saying that you don't know and you really do know because they've worked with you before. And then the C on comparative listening, or I'm sorry, compassionate listening, is really being able to listen with purpose, heart, and humanity, and being able to not make trite the statement, oh, I know how you feel. Being careful to avoid that when possible, because I really don't know how you feel, but I can relate to it in terms of understanding what a feeling like that might mean for me. And people need and want for you to be compassionate, but they really want to have their own space at times to be able to express where they are and not for you to overshadow it by talking about yourself in the moment. And sometimes that is a very easy way to violate trust. So with that background, some of the conceptual components that go into the way I look at it, I want to talk about 3 examples that I've used in the past 2 years. 2.5 years. I've come into my presidency in 2022 here at SUNY New Paltz, and I feel like I had a great honeymoon year. We had phenomenal, we had the largest single gift we got from a donor, great academic year, wonderful thing. Then October 7th, 2023 came and the world shifted in terms of higher ed, and particularly for an activist-oriented campus. And maybe we'll get to this in the Q&R section. I saw a comment about activism in the classroom. And I was challenged with how to approach this, as many higher ed leaders were, and particularly those of us in public institutions. Then we had May of 2024, and now we have a new set of situations. So the uneasiness on campus, it never goes away. So some of the 3 things that I did: 1, first, I expanded the leadership team, moving from not just the vice presidents in the president's cabinet, but including the deans, the library deans, and the director of the graduate programs, convening quarterly meetings where each of them was expected to present goals along with the vice presidents. And since then, we've been, for more than 2 years now, we've been meeting as a group to talk about that. And that has helped to break down silos between this presidential administration office and the deans, particularly, who felt there was a firewall in decision-making and trustworthiness. Number 2, we created president office hours for students. I make these available once a month in a designated place. We have coffee or something like that. And students just have to sign up by hitting their QR code and giving their student ID. All questions are valued. There is no script for it. And I've been hit with everything that can be imaginable, from I have no idea why I'm here, I just saw it and I wanted to come, to the very tough questions about the state of the world, the university, and where we're going. And then finally, and most recently, over the past year, I convened intentionally a group called the President's Listening Learning Community. This is a member of consists of 15 faculty and staff who self-volunteered and were selected out of about 70 volunteers. And we meet once a month to discuss deeper issues, and they get a chance, and I get a chance to hear from one another in almost a sacred space that has really done a great job of increasing our ability to address tough issues. So I'm going to now hand it over to my colleague from the West Coast, and I hope you are doing well out there. And thank you very much, and I look forward to our Q&A segment.
Thanks so much, President Wheeler. I'm so honored to be on the panel, and thankful to Emma Jones for her insightful riffs on the attributes, and to you, President Wheeler, for your brilliant applications of transformational values. And many thanks to the leadership at CDI and to Mylene for inviting me for this panel and for the generous introduction. I really want to focus on how to earn trust. I think this is quite different than trustworthy. Trustworthy seems a little bit too passive towards the commitments that I think we all share. Well, last fall, Mylene and I had a conversation about the role of trust in the post-October 7 challenges facing so many campuses. And without oversimplifying the complexity of that here, my contention then and today was that trust heavily correlated with and provided a strong root system for constructive dialogue on campuses that were committed to, yes, listening and learning. I also believe that strong constructive dialogue capabilities also in turn build trust. They help us build the confidence to express ourselves with respect and not harbor our views. They help us listen in all the ways that President Wheeler has outlined to others in ways that they feel heard and seen and valued. And they help us build common purpose, common ground in the effort to understand, reconcile, and mitigate our differences. Before I isolate 3 lessons I've learned in the process of earning trust and the anecdotes to illustrate them, I want to make 3 preliminary points. The first is a confession, the second is a self-indictment, and the third is what you might call a 2-way underpass on the road to trust. I have a confession. I distrust trust. Like any virtue or value, excessive trust can be bad. None of us wants to trust an untrustworthy person or situation or authority. We don't want to be suckered, exploited, or tricked. A healthy distrust and initial skepticism is good. It's actually vital to our own success and survival. And I don't want to put too much trust in distrust either, especially when it too can be excessive. We don't want to assume the worst in people, social situations, authority. Distrust can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, as those dynamics can be reciprocal and spiral into a vicious cycle of distrust. So this leaves us all with a question. How do we get the best of trust and the best of distrust and avoid the worst of each? And the theme today for me is we have to earn it. And I think constructive dialogue is a powerful way to do that. Second, a self-indictment. We all know that one way to earn trust is to own up to our failures. We don't earn trust by glossing over our shortcomings or just complaining about why people don't trust us. And here, that's why we have to face the big elephant in the room today. Here we are, higher ed leaders, talking about trust precisely when, as Emma put it out, general trust in the broader society in higher ed is plummeting. You don't have to look at Gallup's measure. You can look at a lot of others in terms of the plummeting confidence that Americans have in higher ed. And it's not, obviously, some of it's purely political. Some of it is based on outright lies. Some of it is based on self-serving distortions. But we still have to face and own that these external attacks attach like gnats to serious problems in higher education, with a mixture of perception and reality, a deteriorating value proposition, politicization and effective polarization, perceived elitism and rigging of the system for the wealthy and raw self-interest, rigidity in response to pressing demands, failure to prepare students for work, citizenship, and other life skills. I know this is not our focus today, but we have to own the problems within. And otherwise, we won't earn trust if we pretend that these are just externally projected problems onto us. So that's for another day. My last, my second comment is that, or last comment here is that trust is a 2-way underpass. Earning trust is a 2-way road that runs through our hearts and minds. The first lane points us within ourselves, and the second lane points us to others. So I don't think we can earn trust without trusting ourselves and trusting others. And this is something that gets lost in the conversation. First, pointing inward, with all the incredible pressure on higher ed leadership, external, internal, political, economic, social, cultural, earning trust requires self-trust. And this comes from our integrity. And our integrity comes from understanding our commitments. That is our personal commitments that we bring to every moment, to every person we encounter, understanding why we are here, what's driving us, doing everything we can to actualize those commitments. At the inflection point between my experiences growing up, the way, as someone who was way behind in school in a town divided by race, every day, and I wake up and try to figure out how to help others in my community remove the barriers in their way. Those in particular that block their path to learning and success. And every day I wake up thinking about how I can pull people together, especially against lines of difference, background, perspective, experience, to build understanding and common ground and strong cross-identification in those relationships. Trusting others, pointing outward. Earning trust also means trusting others. We can't ask for trust that we're unwilling to give. And from that vantage point, I want to tell you 3 quick lessons I've learned and what's emerged from them. And I'm calling these lessons: 1, thawing the permafrost; 2, quantum commitments; and 3, blindfolds and cigarettes. So number 1, trust requires thawing the permafrost. What do I mean? Trust grows from an engaging form of respect. And the medium for respect is social warmth. Social warmth grows from a commitment to others, to care for others. When I first arrived at Claremont McKenna 12 years ago, I found a very warm, welcoming, close-knit community. But like every community, we fell short on occasion, and particularly in the interactions between families and the college, students and the administration, I recognized a certain pattern. When a student was in trouble, had a conflict with a staff or faculty member, some of our administrators would respond with a letter instead of a meeting, or when meeting would say something self-protective, risk-averse, preventive of liability or reputational risk, something formal. I called it frosty. And whenever I saw that, I observed it broke a social bond, a trust that was so upsetting to our students or their families or anyone else for that matter. The fracture of that bond created a breakdown that made things so much tougher. And I then recognized that our community's social warmth was one of our greatest assets, but we still had large numbers of students who saw college leadership as a threat to their freedom, mostly around drinking at the time. The issues have changed from sexual assault to race to Gaza, but the principles of trust are the same. Our commitments, our empathy, our warmth had to be surfaced, celebrated, expressed, reinforced through the entire institution, every member of the community, no matter what role they perform. So I'll tell you a quick story. Years later, we had the worst moment of my professional career. We had 2 student deaths in 9 days. And the night after the second tragedy, our housekeeping staff, without any prompt or direction, placed a note and a chocolate on the pillow of each and every one of our students. That showed their love for our students, and that love is returned each and every day. That's my first lesson. Second, trust is a quantum commitment. What do I mean? By quantum commitment, in the intellectual traditions of quantum mechanics and now quantum computing, I mean holding 2 states presumed to be incompatible in one dynamic approach, 2 ostensibly contradictory thoughts in one commitment. And here the dual commitment is this: to express unconditional support for others, unconditional, and simultaneously to hold others to our highest expectations. Now, we think of these as incompatible because we think falsely that expressing support excuses mistakes or poor performance or a breach of ethics. It does not. And we think falsely that holding others to high expectations reflects a lack of support. It does not. My approach to students and everyone in our community is this: I want to make sure they know 2 things: that I love them, that they have my unconditional support, regardless of how well or poorly they're doing, the tough or easy breaks they get, especially in their weakest and most troubled moments, and that I am here to help them lift themselves without self-imposed prejudice or accepting the barriers in front of them as insurmountable, to the highest expectations without constraint. I want them to run their own race and run it to win it without fear of failure or fear of success. And here are a couple of quick examples. My first summer, a young man and his mom appeared in my office. In his last year, he had been expelled for 2 acts of plagiarism right before I started. I told him he had my unconditional support. No matter what he did or how he failed, he will always be my student. His failure is my failure. His success is my success. And then I told him he had a choice. He could feel sorry for himself and let this define his life, or he could learn from it, internalize it, reset, fight his way back to school, and prove he's better than those two moments. If he did the latter, I'd be his biggest champion. And that's what I told him and his mom. About 7 years later, he reappeared at my office. He thanked me for that moment. He was earning his second master's. He had a full-time job. He was married. He owned a home. He was much stronger than he would have been without that initial adversity. I'll skip over my second story just so that we have a little bit more time. Third, trust emerges from an open response to what I call our worst blindfold and cigarette moments. Those times where we have to face the firing squad, when everyone in the room seems to want to rip our heads off because of something we did or didn't do. And not just getting through them, but turning them into a kind of institutional superpower. I've had a number of these moments. Protests in 2015, an alumni reunion town hall after our Athenaeum was barricaded in 2017 by 170 students, including 5 of our own. Tough meetings after an announcement of a major separation from a 3-college shared science program, and many moments before and after that. Nearly 20 years ago, when I was doing a lot of international work, I recognized that participants in programs I ran came with understandable concern, distrust, even frustration and anger towards the program or towards the United States and what I represented in that. In 2004, as an example, I was asked to give a 36-hour workshop on constitutionalism to a group of Iraqi intellectuals. The organizers wanted me to lecture for several hours. I said, why? And they said, well, the Iraqis didn't have a history of constitutionalism. That's absurd, I responded. This is not Afghanistan. Look at your list. Look at where these experts were educated. They follow constitutional developments around the world more closely than many in the US. And this was the kind of arrogance that infuriated the Iraqis, and I knew it. So I started the workshop by acknowledging that, telling them their concerns and frustrations were understandable, and that I was here to listen. So I asked them to tell me each and every one of their concerns. I promised to write it down. And by the end of the workshop, I promised to address each one. I told them I might not be able to allay their concerns, but I would cover it. And that turned into one of the most engaging workshops I've ever been a part of anywhere. And we've all had those moments. And when you have those blindfold and cigarette moments, sometimes you turn the tables away from a focus on yourself and you ask the group, okay, here's my dilemma. What would you do in my case? Or you sit and you write down whatever they're upset about and you address every single claim. And then you get to work in turning those criticisms into real action. Our 2015 protests and the tough moments I had led to the creation of our renowned care center, our full educational response to the 2017 barricades of the Athenaeum, built on our previous work on free expression, and led eventually to the creation of our nationally renowned Open Academy. Our tough times in separating from a 3-college program on sciences led to the creation of our revolutionary Kravis Department on Integrated Sciences. That is, the resilience of our college community through thick and thin, through the many formidable challenges facing higher ed, are based on this approach to blindfold cigarette moments. Face them, listen to the criticisms, own them, correct them, turn them into something much, much better. Now, this isn't a complete recipe for trust. These are only 3 ingredients to keep in the pantry. We may not be able to boil the ocean of frosty distrust, but we can certainly put up a kettle to infuse our social warmth, commit unconditional love and high expectations, and turn blindfolds into vision and cigarettes into healthier learning communities. A few elements only of earning trust, a few consequences only of earning trust. Thank you for all you do on your campuses to earn trust and for joining today.
Thank you so much, President Chodosh, and thank you for the wonderful metaphors. Please, no questions about how to come up with metaphors in the chat either. We've got some really interesting questions in the chat. So here's one. It's been upvoted 7 times. So how do you build trust with stakeholders when they don't support, they don't agree with university policies? You yourself maybe have no control or influence over these policies, but they perceive you as having control over the policies. How do you handle that dynamic as a university leader?
President Wheeler, you take a shot at it.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So, I mean, that is a lived reality. And I think one of the differences between my situation and probably President Chodosh's is that as being part of a very large public university system, there is a conflation of what is public and what is university and what you actually have control over and what you don't. And one of the things that I think has made it possible for me to stay in dialogue with diverse groups is to focus on the mission of the institution and to double down on articulation of why we exist and where the boundaries of what we do actually mesh with other entities and where we can channel energy or where that group or that person can channel energy, and helping even internally our students, our faculty and staff understand the minute ways in which we can control internal forces to achieve mission, and how by achieving mission, we reinforce our position to affect broader change. And again, like through the president's living learning communities, in the teaching moments that I have with students who come to the office hours, that becomes a focus, and the ability to diffuse these very broad desires that I can change the universe as the president of the institution to focusing on things that we can control right on the campus has helped to create student and faculty-led initiatives that are campus focused that we hope will have more global impact.
Marlene, I always want to get beneath the surface of what they disagree with and why they disagree with it, and really understand the values in their observations, and make sure that I appreciate what those are, because there's no policy that's sacrosanct. There's no policy that I don't have the power to try to do something about. And I might disagree with them, and then I'm going to explain why I disagree. And if it's a trade-off that they don't understand, I'm going to frame that trade-off and I'm going to turn it around. Okay, now you're in charge. What policy would you have? And now let me play a little bit of the role of you in pointing out the weakness in that policy against some other value that's at stake. And if I agree with them, then I take that forward and I say, let me see what I can do about this. And I follow up and I say, why don't you come back in a couple of weeks and I'll tell you what I've done and what I've encountered. And what that does is it humanizes the whole thing. I think a lot of times we just defend the policy without having evaluated whether it actually needs to be changed or should be questioned, or even to deepen our own understanding of why we're doing what we're doing. So I don't think that's a hard thing, actually.
So I would just add on that point, at the point you just made, differentiating between what is a policy and what is doing what is in our control. And I've been confronted or in discussions with faculty, staff, and students about things that they claim are policies, and they really aren't. And we have more common ground than not, but through practice and history and maybe the distrust components, we've gone into these polarized zones. And so again, pulling it back to consider what is actually the purpose, active listening, what's the thing that we're trying to address, and finding that common ground is an important component in this approach and strategy I use.
So part of it is really hearing whatever concerns and criticisms and really trying to understand what is beneath all of that, trying to align on a way forward by finding what it is that you have, that you do agree on, which includes the mission of the university. How do you impact the problems and the concerns that are facing your constituents together with the things that you're agreeing on? And then perhaps having an open conversation, or if they change your mind on an issue, advocating for those concerns for a change. Wonderful. Okay. Here's a tricky one. And I actually would love for this person, if you are here, to say a little bit more about what you mean. There's a lot of upvoting. there's huge resistance to viewpoint diversity in higher ed, which I'm sure contributes to distrust. And then there's also another related comment, which I think is related anyway, I'm inferring, that while professors are committed to objective education, a number of them increasingly view themselves as activist educators.
Yes.
So
right.
what is the university's role in this debate? And to what extent do you think activism in the classroom is the reason for the eroding confidence in higher ed?
Yeah. Do you want answers to both of those questions or just the latter one?
You answer whichever part
Okay,
you would
so
like.
first of all, I think on viewpoint diversity, what happens is when you have words, people attach and project meaning into them that they may or may not have that underlying intent. When we first had our Open Academy with viewpoint diversity as the second of 3 legs in the stool, people thought it was an excuse for just bringing conservative speakers to campus. And that is not what it was about, but you have to get over that objection by showing that it's not what it's about. And that's only through giving people the experience with it where they actually understand that it's a much more universal and profound idea than just what speakers we have. I mean, I'm a big believer in principle, policy, enforcement, and in diversifying speakers, but that's not everything we're doing in a higher ed. We're about classrooms. We're about learning what we don't know. We're about evaluating on what we base our own beliefs and views. And that's why viewpoint diversity and embracing other viewpoints is so vital. On this question of activism, I do think we have a very big challenge because pedagogically, if you think about it as a spectrum, we have gone in terms of our center of pedagogy from, let's call it rigorous Socratic, where no one even knows what the professor thinks, to softer Socratic, to professors providing some notion of their opinions, but with some humility and self-deprecation so that students don't feel that they have to mimic those opinions to get the approbation of the professor. And then we went to strong opinions, which creates a virtuous or vicious cycle of attracting students who agree with those professors and an awareness or fear of the other students to not go to those classes because they think they'll be punished for having a different point of view. And now we've gone to some small subset of faculty who think that they need to basically impose a certain viewpoint on their students to tell them not how to think, but what to think. And some of that is even more inappropriate when they confuse what the subject matter expertise is that they have in the classroom with what they want their classes to go do. Now, we as presidents or administrators, we don't have control over what faculty do. We don't regulate that. We can't because of academic freedom and the authority that faculty rightly have over their classes. But what we can do is surface the pedagogies that work well in terms of advancing learning and creating, again, the kind of different types of listening and also dialogue that President Wheeler speaks about, and celebrating those, even if we can't necessarily regulate what I think is a breach of our pedagogic commitment to learning and turning a classroom into something else.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we have just 1 minute left, and I just want to take this last minute to thank the 3 of you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on this webinar, for sharing your stories, for sharing your wisdom, for sharing your expertise, and for the generosity of spirit that you bring to all of your work for the field of higher education. Just a few things. Thank you to all of you in the audience for making the time to attend this webinar. We will definitely be sending out the slides and the recording along with some of the resources that were mentioned here today, so you have access to all of those things. Thank you again to all of you for spending this hour with us. Take care and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.